Okay, the second of the videos on kinship. Key thing I want to get across this time is something that seems fairly straightforward if you're familiar with it. But if you're not familiar with it, I suspect it's probably really weird, really weird. And that's the difference between lineage and clan. Lineages are a group of people who can prove a relationship. So if you think of a genealogy tree, where you have the different names on it, you show the links, in terms of marriage or birth, brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, etc. That's a lineage. American society is almost entirely lineage defined in the sense of Anglo-American society. And of course, legally, that's the way it's set up. And they brought this over from the Brits, I think. Having said that, this is one of those aspects, as with some others, that makes American society actually pretty rare. Most societies actually have another concept of who your relatives are. So if you want to visualize a lineage, think of someone saying that, I'm actually a descendant of one of the Castle family. So if I go knock on the doors of the lawyers and I say, hey, I'm the great-great-grandson of, Edward Castle, one of the Castle founders. And so, I think you guys should give me like $1 million so I can go to Chaminade. First thing lawyers are going to say is like, yeah, right. The second thing they're going to say is prove it. And in a lineage system, you can. In a lineage system, you would have birth certificates, you'd have, other people testify that, oh, this is my brother because he's related to so-and-so. You'd have pieces of paper. So if you want to think about it, the easiest way to think about lineages is they're relationships that you can prove because they exist in the real world, and they exist pretty much in the present. And you see this in American society, for example. If you go back far enough, you find that in the 17 and 1800s, when they printed family Bibles, this is why families had their own Bible, they'd actually print a bunch of blank pages in the Bible. And that's where the family would record all the family information, births, deaths, marriages, all that stuff is recorded in the family Bible. And those, as of 2020, are still legal documents. If you have a family Bible, because you have to remember, hospitals and birth certificates are a 20th century thing, in pretty much 1920s, 1930s. So prior to that, people weren't born in hospitals. Hospitals didn't do that type of thing, and there was no records of a birth other than what you get in, say, the family Bible. So in that situation, those are still lineages. Now, if you think about it, if you go back far enough, George Washington or one of the Pilgrims coming ashore in Massachusetts, then you're not going to have that. Or, for example, if a fire consumes the family Bible, poof, all that stuff now becomes sort of common knowledge, but the proof is gone. And in the American system, to be honest, it really doesn't matter because most Americans have very little concept of kinship beyond their grandparents. So two populations not really that interested in extended patterns of kinship, then a lineage system is fine because that's generally going to be the people that you know personally or you know of or you remember. And outside of that, it's like, they're just sort of the general population. Most of the world operates under a different system. And if you want to put it in easy context, think of it that includes a lot more time attached to it. These are clan systems. A system of clan membership is like a super lineage. It includes all the folks that you'd have in a lineage, all the folks that you're related to in a family tree. But in a clan, it goes back in time. In fact, in a clan, you could sort of say it goes to once upon a time. Because in a clan system, there's sort of two key parts. One is the fact there's a clan ancestor. There's an original founding thing from which the members of the family are descended from. And the second part of that principle is the fact that that original thing is not really something that's human, one. And two, it's not something that's dead. So when you're talking about clans, you're talking about things that exist in long periods of time. They sort of exist out of time, and they involve the past and the present in sort of equal measures, versus a lineage, which is basically, I think, pretty much the present only. So in a clan system, and a good example, just from here, if you're one of the families in Kaunakakai site on Molokai, two of the major families down there are descended from one of these shark gods, who's one of Pele's brothers, who lives in a cave under Kaunakakai. Now, the Hawaiian view of that would be that at some point in the past, that shark thing, which could take various forms, was walking around on Molokai or someplace and got lonely or was bored and decided to make some children. So it literally just, out of its own material and its own mana, it went and made sort of part versions of itself. And those people are the descendants of that shark ancestor, which would also be technically a shark god. Now, that shark god also had another set of descendants, and that would be the things that are gray that go and swim around the water and eat fish, sharks. So the shark made two versions of itself. It made a land version, which are the people that are its descendants, and it made the water version, which are the sharks that are its descendants. Now, the other part of that, which fits into a clan logic, is once this happened, this was a long time ago, or once upon a time, or before time. And secondly is the fact that that shark ancestor still lives in the cave under Molokai. Now, if you're part of that, one of those Hawaiian families, and you really buy into the idea of a clan, then that means that there's a set of people that you're related to by virtue of a common shared ancestry, the shark ancestor. It also means that to a certain extent, you're not really related to anyone else who's walking around on Molokai. If they're not descended from the shark, they're actually then not the same type of thing as you are. I mean, if you want to use a modern Western term, which really doesn't fit you, say in different species. So in a clan system, your set of relationships are very complicated because one, it's a very small finite group of people who share this common descent from an ancestor. It doesn't involve all the other people that are walking around speaking Hawaiian or some other language and look like human beings. As far as you're concerned, the only human being is actually the folks in that same clan. Now notice how to make it even more confusing to someone from, say, an Anglo-American background, is that that set of people also includes a bunch of gray things that walk around and swim around the water, sharks. And thirdly is it also includes an ancestor who's still walking, swimming around on Molokai. So there's stories on Molokai, for example, of this big Hawaiian guy that you occasionally will bump into, especially in the early evening, who, if he's not wearing a cape or a cloak or something on his back, and you'll see what looks like the spectacular tatau of the mouth of a shark. Till you get up close and you realize it's not a tatau, it's actually the mouth of a shark on his back. That's him. That's the ancestor. He still wanders around. It also means that the people that are descended from him have no particular fear about swimming with sharks in the water because as far as they're concerned, the sharks aren't animals. The sharks are relatives. In fact, in most of the genealogies you find in clan, this is certainly true in Hawaii, is the animal form's actually older than the human form. So the sharks actually are your older brothers and sisters, aunties and uncles, and the human forms are the junior members of the family. So the family includes a variety of fish and people. It doesn't include anyone else. Now, since that particular group is who they are, one of the other clans that they can't stand or they don't get along with at all would be the descendants of the pig god Kamapuaa, who you find in places like Kahana on Oahu. There you're going to find families who claim descent from the pig god. He also, of course, made another form of himself, which would be pigs, though actually these would be Polynesian pigs, not the ones you see now. So that particular family would see themselves as a combination of human beings and things that run around with 4 feet and make sort of grunty sounds. But it will also include a tall Hawaiian guy who, when he's walking around, his eyes glow red in the dark, and he's got hair going down the back of his neck all the way down his back. Who's this real powerful sort of attitude type guy, and that's of course Kamapuaa, who still wanders around that part of Oahu. Now, so happens that Kamapuaa doesn't get along with Pele's family. So if you're part of one of Kamapuaa's group and you go and take a canoe or you go, fly over whatever to Molokai, you probably wouldn't want to bump into the guys in that part of Kanakakai because as far as they're concerned, you're not a human being. As far as you're concerned, they're not human beings. So if you've got a clan system, the whole sort of Western concept of people is entirely different. On one hand, it's a much smaller group. It's common descent, but it almost invariably includes animal forms that are actually you're considered related to. At the same time, you're not related to other folks, at least in the United States, you'd call people. The majority of the world's populations comes from clan systems. And most of the world's populations in one way, shape, or form still sort of buy into the idea of clan systems. So clans are a hugely important way that people identify themselves and how they identify others. So if you think about it for a second, the enormous difference between a lineage and a clan would be, one, a lineage is much more variable in size. And secondly, lineages aren't exclusionary particularly, in the sense that outside of the family, you can have a lot of friends, acquaintances, and such like that who aren't at all related to your lineage. In a clan system, a clan tends to be much more insular, much more enclosed. So most of the people you hang out with, do stuff, and everything like that are going to be people who are real people, who are going to be of the same clan, not other human beings wandering around the landscape. And this is, if you understand this, then a lot of the way that people operate in many societies makes a lot of sense. Clan systems are incredibly powerful. And there's all sorts of complex ways this plays out. One of the classic examples would be Chinese society, which is absolutely huge in terms of numbers. And for example, the Zhang, which is one of the big families that you find in central China, that's actually a clan. Chinese families are actually clans. And you can actually go and you can ask them. The Zhang actually will say, you know, there's the original temple where the founding ancestor started the family that's up in sort of north central China in Shanxi province. And that's where the ancestor was, and that's where the ancestor is. And at Chinese New Year's, if you can, heads of the part of the family will go up there and give offerings and burn incense at the original ancestral family temple. In fact, that's what they're called, ancestral temples. And that's your peanut paying PR and gifts to the ancestor who is still monitoring what its descendants are up to. Now, in the Chinese system, clan becomes a little more vague because it's just absolutely enormous. I have no idea how many millions of people are in the Zhang, but it's got to be just absolutely huge number of people are all part of that group. Having said that, if I'm a member of the Zhang and one of you are a member of the Zhang, so if I have a shop, for example, and you show up and I've never met you before, but somehow in the conversation it comes up, maybe the name of my shop has my name, family name in it. And they'll say, oh, you know, I'm from Guangdong, but my family name is Zhang also. And you'll actually go and you'll write out the character on your hand like this, which Chinese do a lot. And I realized that that's actually someone who is part of the same group that I am. In other words, we're part of the same clan. I've never met you. We're not going to have a discussion about whether we share relatives because, you know, there's probably maybe 50 or 100 million Zhang. Nonetheless, I now have an obligation to you, and you have an obligation to me. So for example, I'll give you a discount on the stuff at the store. If you have any questions, I'll help you out as much as I can. You're going to be nice to me because we're family. So even in one of the world's largest societies, just in terms of numbers, there's only about 65 or 70 clans in China, in Han Chinese society. And that rule still applies in a sort of a general sense. But there is definitely a sense that that only applies to folks with the same last name. You got another last name, don't apply. So clan is something that actually drives or motivates a large part of the world's population, and they see it in a very identity way. This oftentimes can be confused with the word family because they're not mutually exclusive. If you talk about Scottish or Irish clans, they'll usually call themselves family. So like the Mackenzies would be a Scottish clan. Now that's also, they also call themselves a family. But the reality is there's actually stories about the original founding Mackenzie ancestor, and I don't know where in Highland Scotland that family's from, but I can guarantee somewhere there's actually, well, that's where the ancestor was, and still to a certain extent, they still insist the ancestor is there. The ancestor shows up every once in a while. So the key thing about clans is that the descendants, i.e. the living members of the clan, are still under inspection and critical review by the founding ancestor. Now, this also makes another really big difference between clan and lineage, because if lineage, if you think about just relationships, you know, that's birth certificates, brothers and sisters, stuff like that, really straightforward. In a clan system, to a certain extent, as we'll see when you get into the idea of mana or sort of ritual energy, your ancestor is actually, on one hand, has made you. Your ancestor is also to a certain extent responsible for you. So the way that you handle your life, what will happen to you in your life, the good and bad things, a lot of that type of stuff is actually tied into your ancestor. So in clan systems, a fairly large, if not a significant part of your religion is actually tied to your ancestor. And traditional Hawaiian society was very much in this way. In fact, for many Hawaiian families, that's still true today. That you still give offerings to your ancestor, you still interact with your ancestor, you just talk with your ancestor, and you still behave in the way you're supposed to behave because of fear of what the ancestor might do to you. So ancestors and clans are a really important part still for a lot of, not just Hawaii, but in much of the Pacific. Clans are still a very big thing. Ancestors are still a big thing. And they're not unique in this regard. They're actually more common than the idea that all you've got is lineages. So lineage and clan are importantly different. If you come from a lineage system, sort of classic Anglo-American, then I think it's probably really hard to grasp the idea of clan. I grew up in a clan system, so to me it's very hard to grasp why a lineage would be important. So clans and lineages, two very, very different things. For most of the vast majority of the population here, they actually come from clan systems. And as you've noticed, when I was mentioning like the Scottish and stuff like that, it's not a Howley versus other thing. It depends on where you're from and what the system was. British, as far as I know, don't have a tradition of clans. I'm not sure why not. But the Welsh, the Irish, and the Scots do. So within the idea of what makes the United Kingdom up, the Brits are actually the ones that are the only ones that don't have. Everyone else that would be considered British, I suspect, probably by, say, Americans, actually come from clan systems. And so you see some very complicated situation. All Polynesians are from clans. They'll oftentimes use the word family, but the reality is when you actually look at it, the minute they start talking about founding ancestors or the ancestor when we originally were formed, you're talking about a clan. And so it's sort of out of time. So clans are a hugely important way that one of the probably 2 or 3 most important ways that people identify themselves. And grasping the fact that a group has clans, you don't have to understand what the clans are. But the minute that you understand that a group of people operate in a clan system, that gives you a huge amount of insight into the idea of the us and the them. Because it's not going to be based on the classic sort of Anglo-American thing of human beings versus other species of animals and plants. It's the us is going to be the folks of the clan, and the them is going to be everyone and everything else. So it's a very, very different way of looking at your relationship with other stuff on the planet. Okay, kinship. Henry's got a pretty decent discussion of this. Most of the stuff is pretty straightforward if you just break it down. So if you think of lineality as being a kinship chart, lines, or lineage, una would mean one, so one lineage. In that there's going to be 2 subsets. So if you look at societies which are unilineal, so you trace descent through one gender or another, you're generally going to trace it through either matrilineal or patrilineal. Now, just to confuse everyone, what you actually find if you go back several thousand years, it appears that the most common form was actually matrilineal descent. It's still actually found in a lot of Micronesia. So you trace descent through women. If you want to think about when you get married in a matrilineal system, the couple would take the bride's family's name. So the groom would lose his name and he'd take his bride's name because he's moving into the bride's family. You're tracing descent through women. The American system, in Anglo-American society, is what we call a patrilineal system. So think of mater as being Latin or something like that for mother. So matrilineal would be mother or female lineage. Pater or father lineage is tracing descent through men. So the classic stereotypic American marriage would be a couple gets married and the preacher, whoever comes up and says, I want you to introduce you to Mr. and Mrs. da-da. The fact that he went Mr. and Mrs. says that the Mr. is more important than the Mrs. And what will be the difference is she will have lost her name and she'll be taking her husband's name. So that's sort of the stereotypic American way. That'd be a patrilineal system. Now, you can do it one of the 2 ways. Now, classically, again, the thing in Chinese society, which is clan-based, when Chinese marry, you certainly see this in China, is that when couples marry, the wife technically joins the husband's family, but she'll always have a hyphenated last name. So she'll keep her name of birth and she'll add the husband's name of marriage, which says 2 things. 1, she's now married because she's got a hyphenated last name. And 2, she's never actually a complete part of the husband's family because she's got a hyphenated last name. And if you think about it, given the concept of clans, that makes sense because she's actually more importantly a part of the family she was born into than the family she's married into. Now, when the kids get born, they'll only take the husband's name, so they won't have hyphenated last names, just the wife will, or in their case, their mom. Third form of these, which is sort of related to this, would be the idea of bilateral. So think about, go back to your high school or grade school science class, bilateral symmetry. So they did what you have is something that's mirrored opposition, but also both sides. Bilateral kinship means that you trace descent through both sides, and this would be the American system today. In American society, people trace descent through both their father's side of the family and their mother's side of the family. This is actually fairly rare. You don't see it in a lot of societies. Tagalog society in the Philippines practices this. Though interesting enough, the Spanish, when they conquered the Philippines, the Spanish come from a patrilineal system. So in Spanish society, you only trace descent through men. I don't think that changed like the 1950s. In Tagalog society, it was traditionally bilateral. You trace descent through both sides, which they sort of kept even under Spanish control. But bilateral symmetry is pretty rare. It's not that common. Usually, the vast majority of populations on the planet, the vast majority of cultures are either matrilineal or patrilineal. In the last, 1,000 or so years, the majority of societies have become patrilineal. And, I'm sure there's been a lot written about it. I've never bothered to read it, about why there was that shift from matrilineal system to a patrilineal system. I have no idea, and feel free to go look it up, because I'm sure there's a bunch of incredibly contentious literature on why the switch happened, or the shift occurred. Next one of these, which is another one of these terms you can break up. You think of primo, which way before you guys were born was a type of beer here, brand of beer. Primo means first or number one. Genitor means firstborn. Genitor means born or born of. So when you're talking about a system which has descent as part of the descent system, is the idea of primogenitor, what it means is the firstborn gets or is responsible for more stuff. Now, again, since I've already picked on the Chinese, I might as well use them again. In Chinese society, primogeniture is really important. In Chinese society, the oldest son, and it has to be the son, the oldest son is actually responsible for taking care of the older members of the family. They're also responsible for taking care of their sibling. So it's not uncommon in Chinese society, this is true of you local Chinese here, to see that the oldest brother, if you've got like, two brothers and a sister, so there's like 3 kids. The oldest one is always supposed to take care of the younger ones. In fact, in many cases, they're actually responsible for most of the discipline and make sure they behave themselves, not the parents. The parents like doing their own thing. That's the kid's job. As the family gets older, that oldest sibling, the oldest brother, will also be responsible for taking care of the parents when they get old. So the entire family is sort of managed by the oldest brother. If there's no older brother, this is certainly true with loggers, like the Japanese, for example. If there's just sisters, for example, so you got 3 sisters in the family, then the oldest sister will take on that same sort of primogenitor role. So in a fair number of societies, what you find is primogeniture is a really, really big issue. This idea of oldest within that generation is saddled with a whole set of responsibilities. Now, one of the side effects, if you think about it, and this is certainly true here, it's oftentimes pretty hard to marry off the oldest male member in that generation, because what lady wants to marry a guy who's got all these responsibilities, all the siblings, they're going to have to take care of the parents when they get old. Who wants to jump into that? And what you'd find in very traditional societies, like traditionally in Chinese society, is that the other members of the family in that group, in other words, the other brothers and sisters, can't marry until the oldest one's married first. I think the British do this to a certain extent. It's certainly true in the royal family. So I'm not sure, this isn't uncommon at all. It's a fairly typical system. So primogeniture means that the oldest born oftentimes get most of the resources. If there's a house, they would be they would get the house when the parents pass away or get old. But it also means they're stuck with all the responsibility for carrying the other members. This becomes a real complicated scenario here, because the vast majority of the Asian populations here practice primogeniture in terms of, taking care of the family and family relationships. But that doesn't fit very well with the American sort of educational social system, which is that parents are responsible for that. And you see this a lot with Pacific Islanders and Asians, for example, in public schools, where if a kid gets into trouble, very typically what would happen is the oldest brother or sister would then go to talk to the teacher about what their sibling was up to. And the teacher's going to look at him and say, why am I talking to you? Where's your parents? Well, I don't want to bother them with this. The teacher will get all agitated because, well, your parents have got to show up. We need a parent-teacher conference. And the parents will show up and they have no idea what the hell's going on, because the discipline in the family was being carried by the oldest sibling. This causes an enormous amount of friction in social services and all sorts of stuff like that here, because we have a very strong primogeniture system with most of the groups here. And yet in the American legal system, that's not the way it works. There's very much the idea that parents are responsible for the behavior of their kids, not the siblings. But, if you go to like the schools here, if you do tutoring, not the semester, but if you do tutoring to schools, you'll very frequently see when school is POW, that the older member of the family will actually grab the younger siblings and then will tow them home. You won't see the parents. You'll see, maybe an 8-year-old taking care of a 6-year-old, or a 12-year-old taking care of an 6-year-old or whatever. And that's the way it's supposed to be. And that system works very well, but it makes Americans, I think, uncomfortable in some cases, because they sort of, where the parents are like slacking off, what the hell are they doing? When, as far as they're concerned in their system, that's not the responsibility. In fact, they have other things they're supposed to be doing. That's the responsibility of the siblings. So you end up with kids that are pretty young that sound really adult when you talk to them, because they're in this situation. I've talked to like 7 or 8-year-old kids who are, taking care of like 3 or 4-year-olds. And, they sound like they're college students. And that's because they've already got a large amount of responsibility on their plate. Now, their siblings, of course, can be little brats or monsters because they don't have any responsibility. That's their brother or sister's problem. So primogeniture is actually very, very common here. And it's one of the striking differences you see between here and much of the US mainland, where it's very much sort of the idea that it's generational control. Age grades, age set. Age grades are real simple. You guys are in them. If you were teenagers, which most of you probably aren't now, that was an age grade. So it's something just like going through the 3rd grade, and the 4th grade, and the 5th grade. It's the idea that you go through life stages. As you go through life stages, which are sort of age-based, there's an expectation on a set of behaviors or options or abilities or what you can do. So go back to what I was talking before, and I was talking about role playing. As you go through age grades, for example, in American society, you change the roles that you do. So if you were preteen, there would be a set of roles that you act out as a preteen. If you're a teenager, there's a set of roles you act out. And 40-year-old folks acting like teenagers looks really weird because they've passed through that age grade, or they're supposed to have. And people get very uncomfortable around them if people are like 45 years old and they're acting like they're 16. You know, that's trying to hold on to an age grade they're not a part of. Most societies have age grades in very, very structured ways, and they're very organized. American society has really sort of flaked out on this. Traditionally, in American society, it'd be when you became of age to have kids or get married, would be then you start to take on the adult roles, and you have to drop the kid roles. In the 20th century, and I don't know exactly when, someone, if you want to, you take a look at this, the idea of the teenager shows up. And what you get is the idea of something between a child on one hand and an adult on the other hand. And this is sort of peculiar to American society. It's become more globally common, but it's still very much an Americanism. Europeans don't, you know, my experience with like the French and the British is teenagers not really a concept they really buy into. The kids that are that age group might sort of like to do it to emulate Americans, but it's not something that the British and the French take as a logical thing. They see it as an American thing, which is funny because Americans see this, of course, you know, with our ethnocentrism, we see as everyone being the same. So those would be age grades. So they're culturally specific. They're not universally common. A lot of them are very, very fixed. And they vary tremendously in terms of how they happen. And they also, within a particular culture, they change over time. Age grades in American society, for example, traditionally, as with many other societies, really benefited the elderly in the sense that if you were old, you had there was a set of sort of roles that you took on, which is sort of like the senior statesman type role or the senior stateswoman type role, and you pretty much ran the family and such because you were the head of the family because you were the oldest. American society now has pretty much entirely lost that. You can argue in some ways that who runs the family now would maybe be teenagers or you know, say folks in your age group. So it's a society where the different age grades have totally changed in terms of their structure, responsibility, and interrelationships with each other. Most societies haven't changed that radically, but age grades do vary tremendously from group to group, and also what's inherent in that particular set of roles, decision-making power, et cetera, varies tremendously. One that you don't see in American society, that's true of some societies. It's not uncommon, but it's not near as common as age grade, which is pretty much found in a lot of societies. This is what we call age set. This is where you have a block of people that are born in a particular area of time, which are sort of seen as being the same as each other. The most famous example I can think of would be Zulu society in Southeast Africa. Zulu society is made of age sets. So for example, if you were born, I don't know, remember this, but if you were born between like 1835 and 1846, you became called Ingoma Mokose. And then Ingoma Mokose was true of every man and woman who was born in that block of time. Now, from the time that they were about 10 or 12 years old, they were taken from their families of birth, and they were raised together in sort of like dorms with folks within that same group of Ingoma Mokose. When they become adults, the guys become warriors fighting in a group called the Ingoma Mokose. The women are then married off in a group to some other age set as a group. So you marry en masse, you do stuff en masse, and you eventually would be settled en masse. So it's not things that you go through, it's a set that that stays with you. If you're in an age set, the age set stays with you as you go through time. What you do changes over time, but the Ingoma Mokose remain that from the time they were born till the time they passed away in the 20th century or whatever. And Zulu society is still set up that way. Zulu society is still largely set up as age sets. which must make life really complicated when they're interacting with folks who don't have the same concept. So age set is sort of interesting. It makes sense when you think about it, but it's just different than age grades. If you want to think about age grades, you move through individually. You're in the 5th grade, you're in the 6th grade, you're in the 7th grade. Age set would be something that stays with you. In fact, the other thing I can think of actually in American study, the only thing that would be age sets would be like boomers, Generation Z, millennials. You think about it, that stays with you through time. So I guess, yeah, maybe we do have age sets in a real sort of Benini way in American society. But I don't know that people really take it super seriously. But in societies where you find it, this becomes one of the main definers or identifiers of who you are. In fact, that's generally people would identify that, as I remember in Zoo Society, you actually identify which age set you are first, then your last name second. So it's a whole nother set of identity, which American society is entirely missing. I've never heard of anyone in American society, hi, I'm a millennial, my name's, Smith, or something like that. People would think you've lost it or something, I would suspect. So we'll stop with that. So it gets us through a bunch of that. Parallel cousins and cross cousins, read the book. I just don't know of any way to explain that really simply, except that it becomes very exciting when you realize in many societies, if you're a cross cousin, you're actually not seen as being related. So for example, in Arapaho society where I'm from, in Arapaho society, you marry your cross cousins. It's actually a preferred form of marriage, which actually makes it illegal in American society. So if you're on the reservation, you can do it. But if you were married and you moved off the reservation, I think you'd be arrested for a felony because it's considered incest. So it's cross cousins were fairly typical. Chinese and Korean society was very big on marrying cross cousins. Less so now, pretty much not accepted. That's because of sort of Western imposed logic. So yeah, look at the book on that one. It's easier to do if you actually visualize it. I just can't think of a way to verbalize it per se. So it's one of those visual things. And with that, we'll come to a halt and I'll go over incest next time.